Imagine waking up one morning to find your entire city, your home, your history, your entire livelihood, slowly sinking into the ground beneath you. Not because of an earthquake, not because of a flood, but because the very earth that once made Russia one of the wealthiest empires on the frozen wilderness by sheer political will and an almost incomprehensible amount of human suffering. Norilsk, Vorkuta, Magadan, Anadyr. Names that once carried the weight of empire, of sacrifice, of nickel and coal and gold ripped from the frozen tundra at enormous cost. But today, these cities are emptying. Buildings are tilting at impossible angles. Roads are cracking apart like old pottery. Entire residential districts have been officially declared ghost zones. And the people who remain, those who cannot leave or refuse to abandon, the only home they have ever known, are watching. Their world collapse in slow motion while Moscow looks the other way. The answer involves collapsing ground, a vanishing climate, a broken empire. To understand what is happening to Russia's Arctic cities today, when Joseph Stalin looked at the vast frozen territories of Siberia and the Russian Arctic in the early 20th century, we have to go back to one of the most brutal and ambitious engineering experiments in all of human history. He did not see a wasteland. He saw opportunity. Beneath thousands of kilometers of permanently frozen ground lay the largest untapped deposits of nickel. Cobalt, copper, coal, gold, platinum, and oil on the entire planet. Whoever could extract that wealth would command an industrial superpower. And Stalin was determined that it would be the Soviet Union. The problem was obvious. Nobody in their right mind wanted to live in the Arctic. Temperatures in these regions routinely dropped to minus 50 or 60 degrees Celsius in winter. There are no roads connecting them to the rest of civilization. There are no trees for building materials, no farms for food, no infrastructure of any kind. The Arctic is, in almost every measurable way, one of the most hostile environments on Earth for human habitation. Stalin's solution to this inconvenient problem was one of the defining horrors of the 20th century. He simply sent people there by force. The ground itself presented an engineering challenge unlike anything builders had ever faced. The permafrost, ground that had been frozen solid for 10,000 years or more, could not simply be excavated and built upon. Heat from buildings would thaw it, causing catastrophic subsidence. They drove long piles deep into the permafrost and built their structures on elevated platforms, keeping a ventilated gap beneath each building so that the ground would stay cold and remain stable. The Arctic cities were engineered to last forever, monuments to Soviet mastery over the natural world. Or so it seemed. The rise of Russia's Arctic cities is inseparable from one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Soviet Gulag system. Between the early 1930s and the mid-1950s, Stalin's regime sent an estimated 18 million people to forced labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union. A significant proportion of those prisoners were sent to the Arctic, where they were put to work building the infrastructure of cities that did not yet exist. Political dissidents, military officers, writers, engineers, farmers, members of ethnic minorities, and ordinary citizens unlucky enough to have attracted official suspicion. All of them were loaded, that defied human endurance. Norilsk was established as a Gulag camp in 1935. It was located in one of the coldest permanently inhabited places on Earth, north of the Arctic Circle, in a region where the ground never fully thaws. Within 2 decades, the prisoners had constructed a full industrial city from nothing. Smelters, processing plants, roads, apartment blocks, schools, and administrative buildings. By 1953, when Stalin died and the Gulag system began its slow collapse, Norilsk had a population of over 100,000 people. It was producing more nickel than any other place on Earth. Vorkuta, further west in the Komi Republic, became the center of an enormous coal mining operation. Its Gulag camp network was among the largest and most deadly in the entire Soviet system. The coal that came out of Vorkuta's mines heated Soviet factories, powered Soviet railways, and fueled the industrial expansion that Stalin believed would make the USSR invincible. The bodies of those who died building it were buried in the permafrost. Magadan, on the Sea of Okhotsk in Russia's far east, served as the administrative hub for the Kolyma gold fields, a region so vast and so deadly that it claimed the lives of an estimated 3 million prisoners during the Gulag era. Gold from Kolyma financed Soviet industrialization and paid for imported technology at a time when the country desperately needed foreign capital. When the Gulag system collapsed after Stalin's death, the cities did not die with it. Moscow found that it had invested too heavily in Arctic infrastructure to simply walk away. Instead, the government created elaborate incentive packages to attract free workers to the north. Arctic workers received wages 2 or 3 times higher than workers in the same industries further south. They earned additional vacation days, earlier retirement ages, and had their food, housing, and heating subsidized by the state. The message from Moscow was clear. Life in the Arctic is hard, but it pays. For many Soviet citizens, especially those from poor, rural backgrounds or from ethnic minority communities with limited opportunities elsewhere, the Arctic represented a genuine chance at a better standard of living. They went north in their hundreds of thousands. They built families, communities, and lives in cities that their gulag predecessors had built in misery. Schools, hospitals, theaters, concert halls, and sports stadiums followed the workers north. By the late Soviet era, the Soviet Arctic reached its absolute peak during the Brezhnev era of the 1970s and early 1980s, when soaring global oil and gas prices gave the Soviet government both the revenue and the motivation to double down on its northern investments. Norilsk was the crown jewel. By the 1970s, the Norilsk nickel complex was the single largest mining and metallurgical operation on Earth. It produced nickel, copper, cobalt, platinum, palladium, and a range of other metals that were indispensable to Soviet industry and highly valuable on global markets. Vorkuta's coal fields were feeding over 200 mines, employing hundreds of thousands of workers across an archipelago of mining settlements that spread across the tundra like a frozen industrial galaxy. The coal kept Soviet factories running and Soviet apartments heated through winters that lasted 8 months of the year. The Arctic workers who built and maintained all of this were, in their own way, heroes of the Soviet system. They endured conditions that workers in warmer climates could barely imagine. Not just the cold, but the polar darkness of winter, the isolation from family and friends in other parts of the country, the physical dangers of deep mining and heavy industry in environments where rescue was hours or days away. The hardship was part of the identity. To be from Norilsk or Vorkuta was to be someone who had proven something about themselves. At their population peak in the mid-1980s, Russia's northern cities collectively housed over 2 million people. They contributed a disproportionate share of the national income. Soviet planners considered the Arctic not an economic burden, but an asset, the engine of a resource superpower that would outlast any rival. Nobody was asking, yet, whether the ground beneath it all would hold. The Soviet collapse in 1991 hit the Arctic cities with a force that nothing in their history had prepared them for. The subsidies that had made Arctic life economically rational for ordinary workers vanished almost overnight. Food prices, previously held artificially low by the state, were suddenly subject to market forces. And in remote Arctic cities, market prices for food were devastating. Heating and electricity costs exploded. The transportation links that connected isolated northern communities to the rest of Russia became unaffordable without state support. Federal investment in Arctic infrastructure collapsed to almost nothing. The population exodus was immediate and staggering. In the decade following the Soviet collapse, Vorkuta lost nearly half its entire population. Magadan lost more than 60% of its residents. Hundreds of smaller Arctic settlements were simply abandoned, left as frozen ghost towns with furniture still in the apartments and books still on the shelves, monuments to the speed with which the Soviet Arctic dream had died. The cities that survived did so because they happened to sit on top of resources that remained commercially valuable even in the chaotic post-Soviet market economy. Norilsk nickel, privatized and turned over to oligarchs in the corrupt auctions of the 1990s, continued to employ tens of thousands and generate enormous profits for its new owners, even if very little of that wealth flowed back to the city's residents or its crumbling infrastructure. But beneath all of this economic and social turmoil, a more fundamental and far more irreversible crisis was already developing. Russian engineers and scientists working in the north were beginning to notice something deeply alarming. The permafrost was changing. The frozen ground that had been the architectural foundation of every Arctic city was beginning, slowly and steadily, to thaw. The turning point in the story of Russia's Arctic cities came not with a single catastrophic event, but with a slow, creeping realization that spread through Russia's engineering and scientific community over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. The ground beneath their civilization, the ground they had always assumed to be permanent, was disappearing. It had been stable for 10,000 years. But as global temperatures rose in the late 20th century, the Arctic began to warm at more than twice the average global rate. The permafrost that Soviet engineers had treated as a permanent geological feature began to soften, shift, and lose the structural properties that made it a viable foundation for heavy construction. The evidence appeared everywhere at once. Buildings in Norilsk began to tilt and crack as their piles shifted in newly unstable ground. Roads across the tundra buckled and subsided into sinkholes that swallowed vehicles. Pipelines bent and fractured. In May 2020, one of the fuel storage tanks at a Norilsk nickel thermal power station collapsed without warning when its permafrost supports failed. 21,000 tons of diesel fuel poured into the Ambernaya River and its tributaries, turning them red and killing virtually all aquatic life for hundreds of kilometers downstream. It was one of the worst environmental disasters in the history of the Russian Arctic, and it was caused not by negligence or mechanical failure, but by melting ground. A landmark study by Russian scientists estimated that by the year 2050, more than 60% of all infrastructure built on Arctic permafrost would be at serious risk of damage or catastrophic failure. The cost of repairing or replacing that infrastructure was estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars, a sum that is simply beyond Russia's current fiscal capacity, especially after years of Western sanctions and chronically low oil revenues. The decline of Russia's Arctic cities is not a single event. It is a slow process of abandonment, neighborhood by neighborhood, building by building, family by family. In Vorkuta, entire residential districts have been officially decommissioned and fenced off. The city's population has fallen from a Soviet-era peak of over 200,000 to fewer than 60,000 today, and it continues to shrink every year. From the air, Vorkuta looks like an archipelago of inhabited islands surrounded by seas of abandoned Soviet concrete, empty apartment blocks whose windows stare blankly across the tundra, waiting for a demolition crew that never comes because there is no money to pay for it. Magadan, once the feared gateway to the Kolyma goldfields and a city that processed hundreds of thousands of prisoners and workers alike during the Soviet era, now struggles to justify its own existence. Its population has declined by more than 60% since 1991. The infrastructure left behind by the Soviets, the roads, the port facilities, the administrative buildings, is too expensive to maintain and too structurally significant to simply walk away from. Even Norilsk, the wealthiest and most strategically important of all the Arctic cities, faces questions about its long-term future that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Norilsk Nickel, which continues to extract enormous value from beneath the city, has discussed plans to systematically relocate residents to warmer parts of Russia. An implicit acknowledgement by the most powerful corporation in the Russian Arctic that the city may not be sustainable in its current form as permafrost thaw accelerates through the coming decades. The environmental legacy left behind by a century of Arctic industrialization compounds every other problem. The air around Norilsk carries some of the heaviest sulfur dioxide concentrations of any city on Earth, the product of decades of nickel smelting with almost no environmental controls. Trees do not grow for 30 to 50 kilometers in any direction from the smelting complex. Rivers and lakes across the region carry elevated levels of heavy metals. The cost of cleaning up this environmental catastrophe has been estimated in the tens of billions of dollars. The political will to force Norilsk Nickel to pay for it has been conspicuously absent in Moscow. Russia finds itself caught in a tragic paradox. The Arctic made it a superpower. The wealth extracted from beneath the permafrost funded Soviet industrialization, sustained the Cold War, and enriched the oligarchs who came after. But the process of extraction has left behind a landscape so damaged and a climate so destabilized that the civilization built to exploit that wealth can no longer sustain itself on the ground it created. The story of Russia's abandoning Arctic cities is not just a Russian story. It is a parable for the 21st century, and one that the rest of the world ignores at its peril, locked in frozen organic matter that accumulated over thousands of years. As that permafrost melts, it releases those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, warming the planet further, which causes more permafrost to melt, which releases more carbon, in an accelerating feedback loop that climate scientists have long feared as one of the most dangerous potential tipping points in the entire Earth system. Russia's Arctic crisis is therefore simultaneously an economic problem, an engineering problem, a social problem, and a preview of a planetary crisis that no country will be able to ignore for long. When the ground beneath entire cities starts to fail, there is no engineering solution that can substitute for a stable climate. There is a geopolitical dimension as well. Russia has not abandoned its Arctic ambitions. If anything, the melting of Arctic sea ice has opened new shipping routes and made the region more strategically important than ever before. Moscow continues to pour money into Arctic military installations, new icebreakers, and strategic weapon systems, even as the permafrost beneath its civilian cities crumbles. The contradiction between military ambition and civilian neglect in the Arctic tells us something important about Russian priorities and about the limits of what pure military power can accomplish when the physical environment itself is changing. Russia built cities in the Arctic to prove that human will could conquer nature. For half a century it worked. Millions of people lived, worked, raised families, and built real communities in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. That achievement, as brutal and as costly as it was, deserves to be acknowledged. But nature is having the last word. The richest Arctic cities in the world are being abandoned, not because the wealth ran out, but because the ground beneath them is dissolving. And the choices that Russia and the rest of the world make in the coming decades will determine whether this Arctic collapse remains a regional tragedy or becomes the opening chapter of something far larger. If this story made you think, subscribe, because every week we dig into the history that explains the world we are living in right now. And if you want to go deeper on the environmental catastrophe at Norilsk or on the geopolitics of the melting Arctic, we have covered both in detail. The full story is even more consequential than what we had time for today.